Boker Tov. Today's daf is daf Mem Zayin in Avodah Zarah. We learn for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael and Asun Batzar Shivya. We're on the 8th line of daf Mem Zayin now. Boy, Rish Lakish. Let's look at the following question: Hamishtacho leDeko. Now we're going to give a little bit of a preamble before this. Before we start here, to describe the issue here. We've mentioned this before. Either a Jew or a Goy, anybody can bow down and make something into an Avodah Zarah. They worship that idol, whatever it is, a house, a church, an idol itself, a statue. You can make it into a Avodah Zarah. But a Goy can annul the Avodah Zarah. He could say it's no longer Avodah Zarah. He could, break it, do something on purpose. A Jew cannot. If a Jew has Avodah Zarah, it's an Avodah Zarah forever. The only thing you could do is destroy it. But you can never get rid of the Avodah Zarah itself. Whereas a Goy, let's say he has an idol. He's a statue of a man, and he says that he's going to bow down and make that Avodah Zarah. He can decide to cut off the ear. He breaks it and say, I'm being Mavatl. He could do that. Now, an Asherah tree, we're going to talk about that more tomorrow, but we mentioned before, they planted it for Avodah Zarah. We discussed the other day, what happens if you had a tree that you planted regularly, and then you turned it into Avodah Zarah? So that was a machlokas. Is that also an Asherah or not? Elon Shanatul B'Sof Avdo, right? Is that mutter or not? Right? There was a machlokas between a comment of Glili and also Rav Yosef Rav Yehuda. That was a machlokas. So now the Gemara asked this question on the 8th line. Boy, let's say you bow down to a tree, a palm tree, whatever, date palm tree. And it wasn't done Avodah Zarah before, but now you bow down to it. Lulavo ma'ol mitzvah. Then can you use the lulav for a mitzvah? Now, if it's still on a Avodah Zarah tree, what kind of a question is that? It's a Avodah Zarah. Can you take a lulav, a branch out of that? So, if it was originally planted for an Avodah Zarah, there's no question. What do you mean using it for a mitzvah? You can't even use it. Can't even use it to sweep your house. Take a branch of a palm branch and use it as a broom. You can't do that either. It's also bahano. It's an Avodah Zarah. You can't have enough from that. The question is a tree that was originally planted just for a tree to grow the fruit or whatever, for shade, and then you worshipped it. In the machlokas we had before, he said that's also a Asherah tree. It's like an Asherah tree too. You could turn a regular tree into a Avodah Zarah tree by bowing down to it. The rabbis who said what? That's not considered a Avodah Zarah. Right, the rabbi said before, mutter, right? That's mutter. That's not considered avodah zarah. We had that if you had a regular tree, and you bow down to it, so the chacham say that's not avodah zarah. So according to him, okay, it's not an avodah zarah, but isn't it still a little bit repulsive to use that for a mitzvah of lulav on sukkahs? So I feel is it considered too despicable, disgusting, repulsive, right? That you wouldn't want to use it for that, right? What about over here? Gabi mitzvah. Now we said on yesterday's daf, we said yesh neva b'mechuber eitzel gavoa. Let's say you worshipped an animal and you turned that into avodah zarah, and then can you use part of the animal for something? Is that also or not? The Baal Chaim Asur L'Gavor Rashi said, "V'afagav the Shor L'Hedya." But now, can you use it for the Beis Hamikdash? Okay, so maybe you can't use it for the Beis Hamikdash, says Rashi. Rashi over here says, "Imtom yesh never mechuber eitzel gavoa." Or here about the mitzvah of lulav. Would you also say you can't use it for a mitzvah? It's not talking about the Beis Hamikdash. Kibach l'Rabbana, leave a mitzvah mi moaz kapi gavoa lo. Kasser of Dim Keretz Yisrael Omar. The question was not by a regular tree that was worshipped for Avodah Zarah, and now you take it apart. You took a piece off of it. Is that usher for Avodah Zarah? Like the case of is that also even to use for a mitzvah? We said before. Let's say you bow down to a mountain. The mountain's not Avodah Zarah, but what about its parts? Its even. Would you say that it's considered worshipped, and now that it's no longer part of the mechuber, is that considered usher, and you can't use something, you can't use it in the Beis Hamikdash to build something or not? And that question really stood. But even if we say that's usher, Over here, we're not talking about ligabo. We're talking about only for using for a mitzvah. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, Rav Dimi Omar Vasher Shabitlikim Boy. Here's the question: it really wasn't a sheira tree originally, but the guy was mavatal. A guy can get rid of it. A guy can say, "This is no longer this horrible. I don't like this tree anymore. I'm bowing down to it." Takes an axe and knocks a piece off of it. Right? Chops it down or just takes a piece off. He can mavatal it. Again, a guy could do that. Yesh dicha eitzel mitzvos. Oh, ein dicha mitzvos. Here's the question. Once it was an sheira tree, you certainly can't use it for a mitzvah. You couldn't use it for yourself. You couldn't use it for a mitzvah. So once it's been disqualified, right? It's been disabled from the mitzvah. Do you say that once it's disabled, you can never use it for mitzvah again or not? That's the question over here. In other words, it was either, the first case was that it wasn't that Avodah Zarah tree, but it was worshipped. And as such, it's considered despicable and you shouldn't do a mitzvah with it. Or over here, it was an sheira. Now it's no longer an sheira tree. But once it was disqualified because it wasn't a sheira tree, maybe for yourself, you can use it. You want to use it to chop wood down and the guy has been mavatal it and you can use it now in your house for firewood. Yeah, that's okay. Use it to build a house, fine. But maybe you shouldn't be able to use it for a mitzvah. Once it was disqualified from mitzvah, maybe it doesn't come back. So tifshlam at a Talmud, but let's try to decide the question from this that we learn like that follow. If you wild animals or birds, when you shech them, you have to have kisui adam. You have to cover the dam with dirt. Kisovanas, let's say you covered the dam with a scala and then it got exposed. The wind came and exposed the blood again. You're yotze already. It doesn't have to stay there forever. So kiso, let's say you didn't cover it, but the wind came and blew dirt on it by itself. Right? Kiso haruach chayev lakasos. You have to do it. You still have to chayev lakasos. You have to do it again. In other words, if the wind came and exposed it, the wind first covered it, the blood, and then it got exposed. You have to do it again because you've never really performed it. If you performed the kisui adam, even though it, so to speak, got reversed afterwards, it got exposed, you've done it already. If the wind covered it up and then it got exposed, you have to cover it again. That's only if it got exposed again. But let's say the wind covered up the blood and it stayed that way. It never got. You don't have to do kisui adam. You don't have to do the kisui adam because it was done by itself. What happens if it got exposed? Once it's been rejected, disqualified, once you don't have to do the mitzvah anymore, it's like suspended. It should be suspended, period. Right? Once it was covered up, it's covered up. What's the difference? You say if the wind covered it up and it got exposed, you have to cover it up again. If it didn't get exposed, you can leave it that way. That's fine. Okay, but once it was covered, you don't have the mitzvah anymore. As long as it didn't get exposed, the mitzvah has been suspended. There's nothing to do here. So once it's been exposed, once it's been rejected or disqualified or suspended, that's it. When it comes to mitzvahs, there's no such thing as being rejected. In other words, even though it was rejected temporarily, but now the wind came and blew the dirt away, you could do it again. So you don't say that since for a time the mitzvah couldn't be performed, you can't do it now. L'chor will say the same thing over here. Even though it was an sheira tree for a while and you couldn't do the mitzvah, but now that it's no longer an sheira tree, maybe you could be able to do it. So let's be posted that from Rav Papa. So the Gemara says no. Rav Papa is not so sure. So Rav Papa Kufa Yipoyle. Rav Papa himself wasn't sure. Mifshib, we're not sure about Rav Papa's halacha. Mifshib Shita Lei Rav Papa. Was Rav Papa sure that Ein Dicha Eitzel Mitzvahs makes no difference? Lo Sol Kul Loshon L'Chumra makes no difference. Once Ein Dicha Mitzvahs, if a mitzvah can be performed, even though it was for a while it couldn't be performed, like the case of the sheira tree, while it was in a sheira tree, or while the blood was already covered up by the dirt that the wind had blown on it, couldn't do the mitzvah. So you say, no, ain't dicha mitzvah. So if the wind then exposed it, you got to do it again. You don't say that once a mitzvah has been rejected or suspended or disqualified or disabled, whatever you want to call that, you could still do it again. You don't say that it's disabled forever. You do it again. Is he sure about that? Maybe he's not sure. When Papa said, you see, maybe it's l'chumra. Well, l'chumra, I mean, l'kula, maybe he said there, we're not sure whether once the wind had covered up the blood temporarily, right? And you couldn't do the mitzvah because the wind already covered it up. The wind blew the dirt on the blood and you couldn't do the mitzvah. He's not sure. And then it got exposed. He says, okay, you better do it again. We're not sure. Has it been rejected permanently or not? Better make sure. Do the kisui adam yourself. That's going l'chumra. But over here we're going a kula. We're saying once you have this tree here, you can either buy the lulav from some kid selling it for 100 shekels, or you can go over to this tree. Kurt's got a tree. You go to the tree and you cut down the leaves from there and use that. That's cheaper, even though it was once used by a previous owner for avodah zarah, and now he rejected it. He was a guy and he rejected it. He suspended it. So that's the question. But here you're making a kula. You want to use something that you'd rather use this than pay for it. Yeah.
There's no end to this business about covering the blood, because once he covers it and it blows away, he has to do it again.
No, he doesn't have to do it again. We said if you covered it and it blew away, you don't have to do it again. But if the wind covered it up, the wind blew the dirt on it.
Yeah. Then you put it back together, then the wind does it again, and there's no sense.
No. If the wind keeps doing it, once it's covered up by the wind, that's it. If the wind exposed it and then covered it up again, there's nothing for you to do. But while it's exposed, after the wind had blown the dirt on it, you have an obligation to do it. If the wind came and did it, so you have nothing for you to do. Again, it's rejected from you. It's suspended, so to speak. You don't have a mitzvah to do unless it got exposed.
Another question: share a tree, is that type of a tree, or is it any kind of tree can become
any kind of tree? It doesn't have to be a specific kind of tree. There's millions of species of trees. Any tree that you planted for worshiping doesn't have to be a particular tree. What do they call those with a B? I forgot the name. The B. Starts with a B, a certain kind of a tree, whatever. They grow them there. Anyway, there's millions of trees, any tree. Okay. So we're not sure of Papa Man, so therefore our question stands. If you had an Asherah tree and a guy was Mavatlet, so it's no longer Asherah tree, can you still take the branches and use it for lulav on sukkahs? Maybe it's still considered disgusting. We don't know. What about, has it been rejected? So once it's been rejected, do you say it's been rejected forever and you can't use it? We don't know. Maybe there, by the case of the dirt, he says, l'chumra, better do it yourself, even though it's been rejected while the wind had put the dirt on it, but now that it's no longer there, maybe l'chumra, you should do it. But l'kula, maybe you don't say that to kula and say, use this string, go buy an ula from a kid for 100 shekels. By Rav Papa. Another question Rav Papa asked, we have a series of questions here, Rish Lakish, we had Rav Meir yesterday. By Rav Meshachel Behema, you bow down to an animal, you consider that a god, right, an idol. Simmer Malches, can you use its wool for tchelas? Now the Gemara says tchelas. What kind of tchelas? Even tchelas the Kohanim using the base of Mikdash, Hanu boyd for their begin. Hanu the boyd Rav Chama. That was Rav Meir's question yesterday. Rav Meir said yesh nevet b'mechuber eitzel gavur or not. If you worship something that's mechuber or mechuber to an animal in this case, and then it came apart, like you used part of the wool, can you use that for tchelas or not? That was Rav Meir's question. The question wasn't really decided. But just based it on that, that's the same question. Each chelos tzitzis, if you're talking about chelos for tzitzis in your house, your own tzitzis, not in the base of Mikdash, hainu boyd or shlakish. It's the same as Rish Lakish question that we started with today. If you bow down to a tree, right? Bow down to a tree, or a tree that was an Asherah tree that had been now reversed, that had been annulled, can you use it for a mitzvah? So here too, you bow down to a animal, and you could say the question is if and it's no longer, and it's parts, we're talking about if it's for the base of Mikdash, that was Rav Meir's question. If it's for your own use, that's the question about tzitzis. Do you say something that you bow down to, even though we're talking about like in the first way, when he said not according to Rabbi Yosef Yehuda, not if you planted it for that reason, but it was just a regular tree that you bow down to, can you use, the tree maybe would be usher, but can you use it for, can you use parts of it for a mitzvah or not? That's the question we're raising over here. Right? That's the question we're raising over here. Yeah. Right. So that's what we're saying. So either way, we've already asked this question. Says the Gemara, no. Einachanami, you're right. You're right. The question was really raised by Rish Lakish before. It's like the question, if you bow down to the tree, can you use the lulav of the tree for a mitzvah? But over here, Einachanami, the Lavin Boile, really shouldn't have asked the question about can you use the tchelis for tzitzis. There's other things over here in the animal. For example, you're right. The question about the wool, can you use it for tchelis? We've already raised, that could already be decided based on the questions of Rav Meir and Rish Lakish. The Gemara didn't really decide those things. The question is, can you use the horns of the animal for trumpets when they use in the base of Mikdash? Can you use the bones of the feet of the animal, the femur or other parts of the bones, for flutes in the base of Mikdash? Can you use its intestines for harp strings? In other words, the Levium who sang and the musicians in the base of Mikdash, can that be used for that? If you hold, there's a machlokes when the Levium, the musicians, is the main shira with the instruments and they just sing along, or is the main mitzvah they're singing themselves, right? They're singing the a cappella, their voices themselves, and then the music is just to sweeten it up. Certainly also, you can't use these things in the base of Mikdash, as it's repulsive, right? Kiti boilecha, aliba demand amar iker shir b'peh. One of those main singing is with the mouth, with their mouths. Presumably call it the almahu. Do you say that the instruments, whether it's the flute or the harp or the trumpets, are simply to make it nice, to add on to it? And you could use it. Or do you say it's still usher? Why? Like Rashi says, because it's considered repulsive. That's the issue. Now, if you hold that ikashir b'kli, it's mashma, you certainly can't use it because you bow down to this animal and parts of it are used there. So that's certainly usher. But even if you say that the ikashir is b'peh, it's still considered repulsive. This question also stands teku. Boy, Rob, another question. Let's say you bow down to a running spring of water. Maim of Ma'al Nesachim. Can you use the water for Nesachim in the base of Mikdash? What do you say there? So, Mike, what's the question? Are you questioning when he bowed down to the spring? Is he bowing down to his own reflection? And he's not using the reflection anymore. He's using the next one. Oh, Dilma, that's certainly. Oh, Dilma, Lamaika, or maybe he's bowing down to the water. And the water turned that into an Avodah Zarah. Okay. Why do you have to ask Kasha about if you say bowing down to the water would be usher? So why talk about a spring? You could talk about a bucket of water, safal. It's something that's you could ask that too. If you say that, right? The batal certainly is something like katolish. If it wouldn't be attached, that would be usher. That would certainly be usher. Question is a running spring, the water keeps moving. So there you might say it's not the same water. So, but if that's your question, that bowing down to the water could be usher, and the only question of you is maybe it didn't move. What about I ask about water which is stationary, like in a bucket? So in there also, is he bowing down to the reflection, his reflection, in which case his reflection is not being used in the base of Mikdash, it's the water, or is it the water? Says we certainly sure that he's bowing down to the water, and therefore, in a bucket, it would certainly be usher. He bowed down to the water in the bucket, the water is usher. Because he could turn anything into an avodah zarah. Here's the question: is he bowing down to the water that's in front of a kamakama asu, and that water is passing away? When he bows down, he's bowing down to this water. By the time he uses the water, it's other water. Is he bowing down to the stream of the water, to the flow of the water, the whole stream? In which case, it's usher. How can you answer something a public spring? You can't answer the water that brings the Rabbim. Just like we said, you can't answer something like a mountain. Why? Because a mountain is attached to the ground. It says Alehorim Elohim Alehorim below Ehorim Elohim. Only what's on the mountain, but the mountain itself is not. And also we learn that public things are things that belong to somebody else. I can't come bow down to your cow or to your tree or to your house and turn down a avodah zarah. I can't answer something which is yours. So something that belongs to the Rabbim, you can't answer because it belongs to everybody else. It's not yours. Lo tzricha. The kanivi me'ara. Some of the gears said me'ara from his land. In other words, it's on his. He's got some water in his own yard. And that's the question. If it would be water in a bucket and he bowed down to it, that's usher. He made that avodah zarah. But here it's running water. And the question is he bowing down to the running water? And the water that he takes for the avodah zarah is not really avodah zarah. And he can't use, and that's the question, can he use that water for the sachem, use it in the base of Mikdash? In other words, these questions are not really, it's more of, is it despicable? Because the question is, can you use it for a mitzvah? Can you use it in the base of Mikdash? For yourself, if it's usher, right? It's either usher or it's mutter. But here we're saying it's basically mutter in these cases where it's no longer an avodah zarah, or it was batel, or was never really an avodah zarah, but would it still be despicable in the base of Mikdash? And here we're saying, here the question is more, can you use it for a sachem? Because if he bowed down to the water, it's really avodah zarah water. If he bowed down to the flow of the water, then he turned the whole thing to avodah zarah, and it was his own water, it was his own spring. And therefore, you could say that the whole thing would be also here. It's mashma really be an avodah zarah. not simply because it's, Rashi says, Likuach Shanar, Beiluch Ishtachava, Varikol Anar Nevet, Bim Yesh Nevet Mechober Asira. If you can, is it considered attached, since it's attached to the ground? If you say Yesh Nevet Mechober, it goes back to the question, Yesh Nevet Mechober Eitzel Gavoa, would you be able to or not? So this could also be a question like Rami Varchaman's original question that we started with on the bottom of Mem Vav and Alf from yesterday's up, Yesh Nevet Mechober Eitzel Gavoa or not? Is it considered something mechuber that if something was mechuber, which we said attached to the ground, you cannot asr unless you make an asherah tree. But if it's like a mountain or a hill or something like that, you can't asr. But now it became detached. Would it be asr to use in the base of Mikdash or not? And that question really stands. The question over here only is, are you bowing down to the water? And if you're bowing down to the water, and only the water that's in front of you, then the water you actually take is not the same water, and that would be okay. But over here, the question, if it's the stream of water and yesh never mechuber, then it could be also in the base of Mikdash. Says the Gemara, like Misha base of some. Let's say you had a house, and your house, the other side of the wall of your house was on a base of Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah was a church. Let's call it a church. You had a church over there, and v'nafal, and the wall fell down here. Also, noso, it's your wall. It's the wall of your house. You own the wall. And but now when you build up the wall, you're doing them a favor because the church is going to use that wall too. So you can't rebuild it. Okay, so what should you do? What you do is you move in 4 amos, which is a good distance, like 8 feet, inside, build a wall there. Because if you build a wall right on their border, they're going to have enough on the wall. The Gemara is going to ask, well, what about the space in between? They're going to use that now. Okay, we'll see. So what should you do? Build the mood in 4 amos. Let's say the wall was a common wall. Today we don't have that so much, but they do have it in places. And the old Yemin Moshe, yeah, you have common walls, and the wall could belong to both people, belongs to you and the base of and the base of Avodah Zarah. So what do? Nidun machzor machzor. Okay, if it's a 50-50 situation, you do 50-50. What does that mean? That you don't have to move it in. In other words, in the first case, the wall went right up to his territory, right up to the Avodah Zarah. So you got to move it in. Let's say the wall was half yours and half his. So you could move, let's say the wall was 2 amos thick. So 1 amma was on your land, 1 amma was in his land. So you're already 1 amma in. So you only have to move 3 amos in because your wall doesn't really go up to the Avodah Zarah. It only goes up to the half of the wall, which is the Avodah Zarah. So instead of moving in 4 amos, you only have to move in 3 because 1 amma was the thickness of your wall. Okay. Avana Beitzav Afaro mitamin. All the stones of this common wall and the wood, the dirt, anything that's in the wall is mitame kasheretz. This is like Zerah Rabbanan Shenemar Shaketz Shaksenu. You have to test the Avodah Zarah. It's tameh, like a sheretz, meaning if it touches you, you're tameh. That's the Rabbanan. Okay. Some say there's a machlokas. Let's say you can identify your stones and you identify his, like they do in certain cases, then some say that yours wouldn't really be tameh, but others disagree. Machlokas among the Rishonim. Rekiva Omer kenida. It's worse than a sheretz. It's matame kenida, meaning it's tameh even b'mago masa shneimar tizrain about the Avodah Zarah, cast it away kamodava, like a thing that's tameh, like a nida. Say tomerlo, tell him get out of here. Ma nida matame masa. A nida's matame. Even let's say a nida had 10 cushions that's on her back. And even they're not touching, she's not touching the top ones, but they're still tameh because it's matam masa. It's even a bigger chumrah. Says the Gemara, understand in the first case where your wall went right up to the church, meaning the church, they were hanging yoizels on the other side of your wall. They were hanging stuff that they were worshiping, there. So the wall is yours, it's not their wall. But they're benefiting by you putting up the wall. So we say move in 4 amos. But you're giving them more space now. What are you effectively doing? You are waiving your rights to those 4 amos. Right? It was over there. You're moving in your wall, so they shouldn't be able to use your wall, but you're giving them 4 more amos of land. That's also giving them a benefit. No, you turned that into a lavatory. That was a bathroom. You use that area there for a bathroom. But how can you use it for a bathroom? In other words, you're exposing your wall is 4 amos in. Then there's 4 blank amos, right? That the Avodah Zarah could use. So you say, okay, it's your territory. You say it's your land. You're not giving him what they call an easement. You're not giving him that. that's really your land. You just don't want them to benefit the wall, but you're going to make a bathroom over there. You sort of need some privacy. So that like basic you turn it into a nighttime bathroom, only used at night, so people won't see you. What's considered modest or private? That you even at nighttime when people can't see, you use the same precaution, using the same bathroom that people would use during the day, meaning that had walls that had some sneers. Even though we use this, doesn't mean literally use a daytime bathroom versus a nighttime bathroom. We're talking about the derech. In other words, you have to be modest. In other words, you have to don't expose yourself at night the same way you wouldn't expose yourself during the day. You might say at night nobody can see you, but yeah, that's somebody as modest, a person who even doesn't expose himself at night. That's what we mean by that. You don't expose yourself. Me, it's a boy. You got to make sneers. So one answer is the other lady to know because he made a bathroom for children. It's not really for adults. Inami, the godale is malignant. What you do is those 4 amas, you put bushes and shrubs there so that they couldn't use it. You put bushes and shrubs there, so they're not really getting hung off from your wall. Okay. Now we're going to get into the definition of really a church and an Asherah tree. There's 3 kinds of houses that were made for churches. We'll see. And really, if the Rashi keeps emphasizing, we're talking about if a goy is mavatal, if he annuls it. A house that was built originally for a church. It was built originally to worship the building. We're not talking about they worship the idols inside. They worship the building itself. It was a house of Avodah Zarah. That's also, unless, of course, a goy was mavatal, wrecked it, broke something in it. Okay. Let's say, no, it was originally a house. It was just a regular house. They were selling a house. It was a house that was used for dwelling purposes, but was replastered or tiled or added something to it. Because they didn't worship the house. It was a regular house, but they added something to it, which they were going to worship the addition, the plaster, the tiles, the addition. No if you can remove that, destroy it. If a guy is mavatal, it's mavatal. If not, you have an obligation to destroy it, burn it, get rid of it. And then you could use the house, because the house was never, that's if the house was never worshipped. The house wasn't worshipped. The house wasn't built for a church, and it wasn't worshipped. They just added some decorations and things like that, plaster or whatever, and they said they're going to worship that part of it. Okay, you can remove that. Let's say it was just a regular house, and somebody brought in an idol inside. You had a traveling salesman. He had his little idol with him, and he brought it into the house. The house isn't usher. Just remove the idol. Both saying he took out a razor mutter. There's nothing to do. In other words, in the last 2 cases, you don't even need a guy to be mvatli. You just have to remove those things. Remove either the extra plaster or remove the idol, and you're okay. If you bow down to a house, you can turn it into Avodah Zarah. You bow down. Let's say, as we learned before, that something that's attached to the ground normally cannot be an Avodah Zarah, unless it was planted or designated, such like an Asherah tree. But a building, or we talk about a mountain or a hill, right? It's attached to the ground, can't be made into Avodah Zarah. But over here, the house is attached to the ground, but it wasn't original. You built the house. You took wood and beams and rocks and stones, and you built it. He said, that tells you it was originally detached, it was self-chibro, and eventually you joined it together, you attached it to the ground. That's any house. Any house was like that. It was originally parts, and you turned it into a house. Kadosh, it's like Tolish, and you can worship that. Ivanan Bonotana. Our Mishnah says, if you built it for Avodah Zarah, then it's Avodah Zarah. But if you didn't build it for that, it's mashmena. No, the Gemara says like this. Bono afbishav shtachbo. Our mission means this: if you built it l'shem avodah zarah, you built a house, a building for Shem avodah zarah, even though you didn't worship it yet, you built it for that purpose, and it's an avodah zarah. Ishtachav, if you bow down to it, afbishalo banu. Even though you didn't build it for that purpose, but you bowed down to it, and it was your house, you had the ability to. Even the guy bowed down to it, or it was your house, and you bowed down to it. Again, you can't ask for somebody else's item, but you can ask for your own. So either you built the house for it to be a church, or it was a house and you bowed down to it and you had permission to bow down to it, you've turned it into a zar. Says Mar Ihachi Shlosha. Why do you say there's 3 kinds of houses? one a house that was built for the avodah zarah, one that you just decorated, added some plaster or added some fixture to it, and the third one you just brought an idol into. There's really four. If you bow down to it, Hani Shlosha Abohavi says keeping the linyan bittul since the gabi bittul. He says Tanan keeping the bittul tan since we're talking about since we're just talking about how do you get rid of it being an avodah zarah, so building it or worshiping it is considered like one. In other words, that if it's a house that was built originally for that purpose, or you bow down to it, either way, it's also unless you're mavatal, unless the guy was mavatal, whether he built it for that or whether it was worship. The guy can be mavatal. But the other ones are you don't even have to get rid. You don't need bittul. You just have to remove the addition or remove the idol. Says the Mishnah, Sholosh Avonasan. There's three kinds of stones. Similar to what about the house, similar thing to the stones themselves. Even shechatzo metchila labim. So let's say you excavated a stone originally to be a pedestal for avodah zarah. Now, when they worship the avodah zarah, they worship the pedestal also. We had before. Remember that even when they removed the idol, they bowed down to the pedestal. So when it was originally excavated for that purpose, that's an avodah zarah. Harezu asura. So again, it was a stone that was originally excavated for that purpose. That's asur, because now it's detached. Even though we said before that if you worship a mountain and then detached a piece of it, there's a question about using it for gavoa. Can you do that? In other words, I never the lav carbon gufa kaboy elin binim misbech machshire carbon near carbon done benevet asur. But I don't know. In other words, once it was worshipped. For an individual, you say it's certainly not avodah zarah. But would you answer it for, just like, for example, an animal that was worshipped, right? That was worshipped, cannot be used for a carbon, no matter what. Even though if a guy had it, he was mavatlet or whatever, it was worship, it can't be used for a carbon. Or let's say somebody bowed down to yours. Maybe you couldn't use that as a carbon. But you could use it yourself. It's kosher to eat. You could check it and eat it. So here, the question is, a stone that was originally excavated for that purpose, not that it was an avodah zarah before, and now we're talking about, is it mutzah for you to use? Maybe for Einachanami, the question about Gaboa, could you use it in the base of Mikdash? That was the question that Rav Meir Shapiro had before. Yeshem mechubar eis Gaboa or not. When you excavated this to be used as a pedestal for avodah zarah, Einachanami, maybe you wouldn't be able to use it for a base of Mikdash, but it would be also for you or not. Harezu Asuras. He said that's also for you to use. It's also for you to use because it was originally excavated for that purpose. Rashi says linyan bittul. Right, right. Makam Moshe v'Arskachavim sheMoshe v'Atzelam Aleh. So that's the question of Reza Surah. Va'afilu lo hemed alav Surah chasvet. Surah avikom yinin avikom vatlet. L'chasim menama'at ad shetifkem. V'im Yisrael chasvet. If a Jew had excavated for that purpose, it would be also forever. That's the question he raises over here. Again, side of b'chayda. Let's say you just plastered on it b'chayda. Again, just remove the addition. In other words, you didn't mean to worship the stone itself. You meant to worship the decorations that you put on there, the plaster or the tiles, whatever you added on. Just remove the animal materials. Let's say this pedestal was never intended for avodah zarah at all. It was just there. You had a little pedestal, and you put the avodah zarah on there for a while. Silky, you removed that, raising mutar, so no problem. So that's similar. These three cases are similar to the cases of the house. A house that was originally, you could argue that all stones originally were removed, but the house that was built for avodah zarah, the same way that the stone now we're talking about was excavated for avodah zarah for a pedestal. That's also, unless the guy is mevatel it, it's also forever. The other cases, you just have to remove the addition. That's when you actually when you plastered in the gufa. In other words, you engraved it a little bit. You took a knife or something or some metal instrument and you indented into the stone. But we talked about this is similar. These three cases were similar to the house. And by the house of Bais Lab Begufehu, in the house you just added the plaster on top. Omitzar. In the house also it's between the bricks. You added some plaster there. Mila skin the shy about a shy. How do you know that? Maybe it's speaking that it was already plastered and there was no room between the bricks. Now you're just adding on more. So therefore, it doesn't have to be in the stone or in between the bricks themselves. Means this, even though even though when you put the plaster and the tiles on it, whatever you added on there was, you did it in the stone. In other words, you cut out part of the stone and add it in there. If you remove that, that's okay. The Mount is saying, I might have thought keeping the side b'chayit since you plastered and tiled it. It's as if it's like a stone that you originally excavated for that purpose. The titzer would be like the first case, it would be usher. The titzer cool, and the whole thing should be usher until a guy is mevatlet. Kamashmon, that we don't say that. In other words, if you excavated originally for avodah zarah, for a pedestal, then it's usher. If you didn't, you just added on plaster, or you put an idol on top of it for a while, you can remove the plaster, remove the idol, and you're good to go. You can use that. All right, we'll pick it here tomorrow, Mitzvah Shem, on Daf Memches, about the Asherah. We'll talk tomorrow about the Asherah tree.